Hello, I'm Karen Christensen, and once again, I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Matt Silber in Connecticut. And we're going to talk about some big issues in this broadcast. And Matt, it was Matt who first suggested that we talk about some of the coverage of trains and building, especially building high speed trains in the United States. That is part of the new book Abundance by Eric Klein and Derek Thompson that has got quite a lot of attention. We keep seeing reviews. I just saw a friend's review. A friend in Australia wrote a review of it, so it's obviously getting around. Um, and it does have some general. It covers obviously. It's not a book about trains per se, but Matt, why don't you explain why you brought this to my attention as something that we should talk about here at Train Time?
Thanks. Thanks, Karen, for having me on. And not to be a pedant, but it's Ezra Klein, not Eric Klein. Just I think you said Eric Klein, but
Oh,
um,
thank you,
but
thank you.
I so I was reading through this. I've been following Ezra Klein a little bit. He has that podcast, Pod Save America. Just in online reading, I saw that this book came out. It's definitely been making some waves. And the central thesis, I think, really spoke to me. The idea that, you know, we have to we like we're really at a precipice in, the United States of like what kind of future we want to have. And there's this like dichotomy presented
Hmm.
in the book between scarcity and abundance. The idea that do we have to make do with less, or can we make as much as we need for everybody? And part of that whole sort of philosophical position, I thought kind of underpinned why I got involved in trains to begin with.
Hmm.
Um, I just, as a person, I feel very strongly I want more train travel to happen. And from your experience, we've talked about this before, it sometimes is tricky to actually get it done. So I think the central conceit of this book, the idea
Yeah.
there are steps that we need to make, with steps we need to take to get things done, to get the things we want done, are is really it's just something that really spoke to me. And I thought, I figured, it would be worthwhile to run it by you, and we could have a discussion about it because I really like it, and I'm curious what your thoughts were.
Well, I think they make extremely useful points. And my question is where do we go from here? Because this is in some ways this is saying that the Democratic Party is more known for regulations, control in terms of environmental protection for one thing. Um, Which, has been an excellent thing. In fact, much when I was still living in England, but started to travel back to the States, was one of the things people admired, the consciousness of the way government needed to protect endangered species and to think about wetlands, in long term, wetlands, hugely important. The protection of wetlands in terms of the today's climate, the related emergencies and flooding, really, really important. Um, but bogged down for sure. And that has hit me really hard in working on rail, is seeing how things don't get done. And it's been especially striking because I've been so involved with China over the years. In fact, the train campaign began after I rode a high-speed train from Shanghai to Hangzhou and back one day. Um, it's just extraordinary to when you ride a good high-speed train. It wasn't the first one I'd taken. I actually had ridden high-speed train in Japan years before. Um, but China's building these things new, and now they have 28,000 kilometers of, no, I'm gonna get the numbers wrong. I started writing out all the miles and the kilometers for different trains.
I know,
But,
I'm too America
they
brain,
have
I can't do the conversion in my head.
but they have more high-speed rail than anyone else, and they have built it very quickly, and it
And
is
so
it's
quickly, right.
used, and it's used.
Mhm. Right. Mhm.
So, the proof of concept is there, right? that's one of the problems with these very long drawn out, very expensive projects. People just see money going into the ground, basically. That's how it feels. And the taxpayer who's funding it isn't getting anything out of it. That's why I'm so interested in low-hanging fruit, because people need to see proof of concept. They need a chance to experience train
I
travel.
agree, and that's why, and that's and the part about I mean, if anybody listening reads the book, they talk in more detail about California high-speed rail, of which I'm a huge proponent, and I think but you read it, and to your point about China, China has built, hundreds of thousands of kilometers or whatever it
Mhm.
is of these high-speed rail that is used, that is functional, that makes money, and people in California are looking at a project that was supposed to be finished 4 or 5 years ago and connects San Francisco and LA and is 5 to 10 times over budget or like 5 times over budget.
Yeah,
And maybe there might be a connection between Bakersfield and, some other, Central Valley towns in the next 5 to 10 years. So I'm not saying we should stop that project at all. I'm saying that there's a very powerful lesson there in that China has been able to run laps around us in terms of building these rails, and it behooves us as Americans, you and I, as people who support trains for whatever reason. I mean, I love trains because they go chugga chugga choo choo, but I also love trains because I think they're good for public health. I think they're better for the environment than car transportation, and I want more of them built. And I think if every project in America follows the California high speed rail model that is decades behind schedule and billions over budget, we're not gonna
we
get
won't
there.
get anything.
So
And
that's
it
what
and it's it
right.
gives such a negative message to anyone who is
Yes.
opposed to who thinks we should instead just be investing in more roads, expanding roads. Um, I have 2 examples, both these are from my 2 children. One, my son went to Gansu Province in 2009 and was part of a geographical project that was studying, renewable energy introduction in villages in Gansu Province. And he said, "They're just doing it. They're putting up solar panels, they're putting in micro, methane collectors all over. The government decided it was a good idea, and they simply went in and they gave the villagers the methane collectors, and they installed solar panels, and it just happened, it blossomed. It's we can complain about top down, but there needs to be leadership on these things, and, there's a reason that China is so far ahead on electric vehicles, and renewable energy. It is not because of cheap labor. I mean, there's been some I'll put in the show notes a link looking at that. It's because they've done a lot of things really well in these areas. Um, so I heard that from my son, and about the same time, I heard from my daughter was taking an environmental studies course, and she was told to look up a project and write some environmental, you know, the study they do before starting something. I don't know what exactly it was. And
The environmental impact
Yes, an
review sort
impact,
of thing, I think
yes.
it could be called.
Right. So she had to write a
Yeah.
paper about it, so she signed up for it. Well, for years after that, she was getting huge packets of documents in the mail from the government about this environmental review because she had once written a paper about it. Now that is a waste. She was interested, but only while she
Right.
was writing the paper, and it made it clear how
Right,
long the
exactly.
whole thing was taking. Years. She'd graduated.
Years,
Yes,
right,
she'd
and
graduated from college by then. There's still these I'm saying there's some big package for you from the state.
so I don't wanna interrupt, but, somebody's been poking their head behind my computer. So, this is Mystic. Mystic, if you wanna say hi, she's being a little squirmy, but she just doesn't like it when she's not the center of attention, so I just wanted to give her
Give
her
her a
moment.
little
She's
moment
wandering
of
around, but,
glory. Yes.
exactly, but, yeah, like, and to your point, like, I don't want people to get misconstrued and think I'm some kind of like People's Republic communist person, but I think it behooves us to examine what China is doing right because to your point, things get done, and that's important, and examining the context of, more liberal democratic kind of perspectives, I think the earlier political generations, my mom and I talk about this sometimes when I am like, "Well, I think we should cut down on some of the regulations so we can build more trades and more apartments." She grew up in the generation where
Mhm.
regulations are what saved the bald eagle, right? Regulations are what kept farmers from using
Yeah,
DDT.
yeah.
So when she says that, she's like, whoa, 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 a minute. But I think it's also, we need this kind of paradigm shift of, okay, what regulations protect the species we care
Mhm.
about? And what regulations are really just preventing us from doing what we need to get done? How, like, are we letting the process be the enemy of progress, if that makes sense? You know what I'm saying?
Yes, and certainly the blame for all the delays is not just with government. It is with the structure, the relationship between government and the corporations and the consultants who do this work, because the work that's done on rail and even the running of rail systems in this country, especially regional rail, they're run by private companies, and it's private companies that are doing the majority
Mhm.
of the building. And I I think we know far too little about those contracts. They tend to be very hard to get copies of. I have a little experience with this. Well, what exactly is the agreement between Massachusetts and X? This seem th So
Mhm.
transparency seems to me one of the issues there, and when I was thinking about it before we talked today, how do costs balloon in this way? In in
Mhm.
in in business between corporations, you make a contract and you commit to a certain result for a certain amount of money, and there's agreements in contracts about whether change orders are allowed and what charges can be made against them to control the people doing the construction from simply upping the cost, coming in at a low price and then upping the cost. I don't know what's happening with these projects. I mean, we had the big dig here. There's some big rail projects in the east as well, like the tunnel under the Hudson. Um, I wonder how things are being managed, and I don't think that's really addressed in the book. Am I
Mm.
right?
That you do raise a good point. Yeah, and I think they kind of address it when they bring up, I was flipping through it, I couldn't find it, but they brought up San Francisco, how San Francisco kind of there's also, like, this sort of idea, like, well, the government will contract out to companies, and that will save the government money rather than doing it ourselves, but actually, San Francisco found the inverse, where they were like, "Let's just build the BART cars in-house. We'll just hire the staff that we need, we'll hire the engineers,
Mhm.
and they ended up saving money and doing it faster because they were just like, "We'll just keep the expertise in-house. We won't have to go to a contractor who goes to a subcontractor who carries and drags this thing out. We can just let's just do it ourselves." And when you tell people that, their brain goes like, "No, no, no, government shouldn't no, no, government will spend too much money." But it might go against what you think, but no, actually, that could save you money if you just
That's
keep it all under one roof, siloing
yes, I
everything.
I can think of I can think of the when the Regional Plan Association studied the building of the 2nd Avenue subway in New York. They absolutely part of their conclusion one of their conclusions, they couldn't figure out where some of that money went. Um, again, transparency. There was money that just sort of disappeared into a black hole. But they also said it was
Mhm,
all the contractors and the consultants that really ate up dollars and made that project like all the seemingly, every other one go way over budget. And I remember talking
mhm,
to former Governor Mike Dukakis. He was a real believer in running things from running things yourself, having your own department of transportation really in charge instead of just having a few people and not engineers, kind of contracting out all that work. He felt that you got a better result and faster. And I think his, the things that he accomplished were proof of that. And unfortunately, it's just
Mhm,
gone the other way. And we see we see it in housing, in building these. Um, and so things are delayed, and this thing of there being seemingly no control over the costs. Somebody can put in a bid, and then it's
mhm.
simply I mean, how can I'd like to know, if you had a contractor doing your house, you would have in your contract, there would be specific clauses about change orders. There must be in
Mhm. And,
government
like,
contracts as well.
if you had a contractor who was retiling your bathroom and then, they said they'd get it done in Thursday, and now it's, now it's a year later, and they actually, they said it cost $5,000 and it's now 15,000. Like, okay, well, what like, when is this gonna eventually, could I like, what are you doing? You know? And I think when people see
Right.
rail projects kind of balloon like that, they lose faith. They say, "Ah, cut your losses," which is too bad because, that's not what we want to happen. So, it's, and I like how you bring up that example from Dukakis,
And you
and yeah, you're absolutely right. His legacy lives on.
Yeah. He's,
Karen, is there a delay? Because, like, I feel like I talk and and then you pause for, like, a minute. I just wanna make sure.
Yeah, I'm hoping that the software will smooth it because 'cause we're a little bit jerky here, but,
Okay, good.
we'll I think it actually this is where the AI system, I don't know how they do it, but they will smooth it out. Um,
Cool.
do you know California, the terrain and what they're talking about? 'Cause
Relatively, um, a dilettante interest,
because this
not a level of expertise.
Because I grew up in California and went to college to California, and so when I first heard the idea of San Francisco to LA makes sense. Anyone would think that, that's a logical thing to consider for high-speed rail. Um, but they've ended up with something, um, com completely different. Now, I'm not sure how they ought to have approached it, but they needed to do something different. That was a just to s there seems to be an inclination in this country to set out some really grand plan that doesn't I'm not sure anyone is confident that they can pull it off. Don't understand why when we see this over and over again, we see big projects talked about for years and years and years and years and years. The North-South Rail Link, for example, I'm not sure you could break that up, in Boston, or the tunnel I forget what they call the tunnel under the Hudson. These are major new construction efforts. Um, and sometimes they can't be staged, but a rail line, probably even a high-speed line, could be staged and could be done in a way that was, more sensitive to public opinion and that gave people something. The other thing they did in California, and this has to do with regulation, it has to do with, property rights. Property rights are great. Property rights are hugely important, and they don't exist in China at all in the way they do here. So that's one reason that Chinese they can decide to do stuff. Um, and they just
Mhm.
move like
Which
building
is kind of
dams. They
like
just
why,
move.
right, which is why I want, like, I don't wanna say, like, I'm an advocate necessarily for, communist China sort of application of
Right.
legal application. I'm just saying maybe we could take some of the good parts to make it move a little faster.
Yeah. Yes, we need a different approach, not and we will never have and shouldn't have and shouldn't don't want to have the approach that China has. It's very different in terms of its governance and land rights. But but,
Mhm.
um, th I think a lot of it has to do with, they do are managing things effectively in many ways, and the California line, they're also doing it in terms of they're doing it in a way that makes sense, in terms of the setup, the actual travel time, and I was really struck by this, for example, when I first that time I first took the Shanghai-Hangzhou train, and that was interesting to me because Hangzhou reminded me in some ways of the Berkshires or, this part, north of New York, even though it's a longer distance, but it's a very beautiful city, famous for it's got the most beautiful lake called West Lake. And I was there in a beautiful time, and yet that's where Tencent and Alibaba are headquartered. So, big, serious tech
Oh,
companies
okay.
with lots of employees. So, I thought, "Wow, just think, you're and then you're connected to Shanghai." So, I thought, that's really amazing." But what happened on that trip, I'd been in Beijing, and I flew to Shanghai. But then I was taking the train south to Hangzhou, and the train station was right next to the airport. I literally walked out of the airport and walked along to the train, and that's a sensible way to organize a transit system. Um, whereas what they've done in LA is instead there's a famous LA train station, very beautiful. I haven't been there, but I've read about it and seen pictures. Real classic Hollywood stars arrived there in the, 30s and 40s and 50s. And the high-speed train, instead of going there or someplace near this existing rail, because Amtrak does run trains there, um, they're putting it someplace quite a long way outside the city. So, what will people do mostly? They'll drive to get the high-speed train instead of
Yeah, and that I think
getting it
speaks to,
from the city
like
itself.
like, um
Um,
how, like, we kinda do these things, like, almost piecemeal, and we're like, "This is all we can get done now, so, like, we'll just do this," and it's like it's like a self-defeating sort of experience where it's like, you want people to use it, so you need to do it the right way so they have access to it, right? Like, as you said, people wanna make as few changes as possible. If you're
yep,
telling them, like, "You could take the high-speed rail, but then you take it to a bus depot that will then take you to the Amtrak station, then, like,
yep,
all of a sudden, people are just like, "I'll just drive. I'll just drive. Forget it." And that's not what we wanna
yeah,
do,
yeah,
I love
right,
trains, and I'll take them I would do it for fun
right.
if I can,
Um
but that's not most people.
Now, one thing, that surprised me when I was looking up figures comparing China and the US is that we actually have a lot more, miles of operating train track than China
Huh.
does. Lots more, nearly,
I would not have expected that.
close to twice as much, close to twice as much. China has a lot of train lines and they do have freight. Um, they have a lot of train lines that are not high speed. So, there's, um so but we have far, far, far more, but most of it is freight. But it's a wonderful resource and underutilized and under-considered because I think it's not very sexy. It's not very, it's just old train tracks with freight trains running. But the huge advantages of those lines, as we've talked about before, but the fact is, the ones we've talked about are just a tiny fraction of what exists in this country. And the thing is, the lines are there, the right of way. So all these property issues don't really apply because the tracks are there. They're often owned by the state rather than sometimes by a private railroad company, but often not. Um, they sometimes, in the case of regulation, they sometimes because they're existing rail lines that there's, the clauses that grandfather in, you don't have to do as much, um, review, impact review, if they're already there and operating. So that's really low-hanging fruit, and we have in this country 159 no, we have 180,000 miles of rail line
Wow. And
from what I looked up.
and that's
I
a
mean,
lot.
and
So
it's there.
what per what portion of that is unused and what portion is, like, currently active? Do you know?
There's actually a I remember seeing a map. There is someone has made a map that shows it, but a very small proportion of it is used for, passenger rail. That's why there've been I've, read about other projects like ours or campaigns that, in Indiana and maybe I think Oklahoma, really scattered, but that want to have passenger trains on some portion of the line that exists now. Now those lines often need to be upgraded, but I remember a friend coming to visit me when I was at college in Santa Barbara from San Jose. She simply got a train from the San Jose train station to the Santa Barbara train station. Those that route, I think it's a bit like ours in Massachusetts. I think it was one a day, but it exists. And so my question when I look at these huge numbers, these billions of dollars, what if they had applied that money or some of that money to improving travel on the existing route? Because you can bring train tracks that exist up, to a higher grade so that the trains can go faster. Maybe not high speed, like not the 200 mile an hour, but actually for sure, it takes a while for trains to get up to that distance, and really high speed trains. The problem is that they can't or don't make frequent stops. So sometimes that's what people in England complained about with the HS2, the high speed rail line that was planned, is that it would go to the big cities, but would skip over the smaller cities, and that there's that kind of bypass problem of all of a sudden people, aren't stopping in I don't know, Peterborough or whatever it might be on the way to Birmingham. Um, and so there might well be an argument for devoting money to improving to adding service, improving service on some of the existing lines and expanding there, because we're talking about an awful lot of money. But how could you do that without some real leadership on a national level? Because it's a system. It's not just one little line and one little line or one big line and a couple little lines. It all needs to connect.
I think, yeah, I you like, what you say, and I think what, like, drew me to the train campaign when we had our first, like,
Uh-huh,
email contact was, you were advocating for that line through Pittsfield down to Danbury,
uh-huh,
and that's kinda what I'm all about. Like, it's right there, and again, like, to your point, will it cost money to bring it up to code? Probably, a little bit, but not nearly as much as high-speed rail. So I think a lot of times they think it's like, "Oh, we have to go with the big sexy option of high-speed rail," and it's like, the tools at your disposal are at your feet. And what I also see, like, I've mentioned this a couple times, I just see this great dovetailing with increased train excess connection and the solution to the shortages of housing that is
uh-huh,
driving people out of their homes into the streets. And you mentioned this in your email, and I just want to touch on it. I think
uh-huh.
I had a great experience on the MBTA a couple weeks ago with some friends of mine. We took it to
Oh, yeah.
Boston from
Uh-huh,
Sharon,
uh-huh,
and one thing I noticed was that you often had the park and rides. There's one right,
uh-huh,
like, over by Foxborough that's just on the highway. It's just like,
uh-huh,
there's the highway, there's the park and ride. I think those are good. I think they're great, but I think the land around them could be used a little better. I think you could
uh-huh,
have like, most of the parking lot spots were empty, and all out like, in my mind, what I see are apartment buildings and pizza shops and things that people want to go to and take the train to. Because I think we kind of think of trains just serving as a carriage to get commuters into and out of their nearest city. And I think England, I mean, I haven't been there in decades, but I think in England, it's much more common for them to be, take it to lunch or take it to, your friend's house, to take it to visit
Sure.
friends. And yeah, just like for those reasons, I think embracing, the little projects, the Maybrook line, the Berkshire line, those can really dovetail nicely with other needs that we have without dumping all our money into a hole. Not dumping our money into a hole, I misspoke, but, like, spending a lot of money on high-speed rail when it's just like, well, we could
And in
I'm running
terms
my
of
mouth. I don't know where
building
I'm going
and
with this.
in terms of building public support, and that's really in some senses, that's what abundance is about getting people to think about things differently and coming up with a more of a positive approach, to the future, instead of kind of always feeling constrained and struggling and like nothing can work, which is really silly. I mean, I think p- America has had for many years a reputation for building things, creating things, being the innovators. Um, we built the railroad across the country in like a couple of years. um,
Mhm.
uh,
Like, one anecdote that comes to mind that, like, the book is talking about how, yeah, as you said, we used to build and innovate, and, I think about how in the Second World War, we were afraid that we wouldn't be able to get the rubber that we needed for the tires for all the trucks that we were gonna need to transport supplies
mhm.
everywhere. So US scientists synthesized rubber. We made it in a lab. And that's the kind of energy that I think abundance that's why I think so many
Yeah.
people, on the general liberal, progressive sort of side of the aisles, should consider reading and really internalizing the idea that we shouldn't, try to think of we shouldn't say like, "All right, well, we just gotta cut the pie differently." We should make a new sugary dessert that we haven't even conceived of yet of unprecedented deliciousness, and it's like the old sort of belief that government is the problem, that, we have to stop the government from acting, that we need to restrain the power of development and invention and innovation. We should change our minds a little bit, and we should say, "Well,
Mm.
what instead of trying to stop things from happening, what can we do? What great things does the future
Because
have
we
in store for
know
us?"
because we know things need to be done and need to be accomplished.
Right.
And we have, the Chinese name for America is Megwa, beautiful country. And this is a beautiful country with abundant resources and beautiful landscapes and a whole lot of things like that are untapped into human capital, but also things like when I read that we have that much rail line now in existence and operating, that is that is a resource that should be tapped. Not all of it. We don't need to turn all of it into passenger service. You'd sit and you'd figure out quite easy nowadays to figure out where there are more traffic problems. You'd think about, well, instead of expanding a highway, why don't we add a train line there? Why don't we make train lines that connect? Why don't we, think about where people wanna go, it's often I've noticed, for instance, in North Adams, the state spent a lot of money to revitalize North Adams by supporting mass MoCA, which is fine. I mean, they build this thing, but then they didn't connect it, and I've heard from lots of people in North Adams who say, and it's a famous area for trains. The Hoosick Tunnel is up in North Berkshire County, and is a train line that goes there or went there. Um, and why not think about that as a way that would something that would revitalize, cities in conjunction often with something else. It's not just, there's this, um, a lack of imagination, a lack of ability to think about is to think it as of things as a system. A town's a system. A village is a system. Train lines are a system. Communities, there's you have to think about the pieces that are needed that go together and that you end up with something that's greater than greater than the sum of those parts. And transportation, good public transportation is one of those essential pieces. I want to hear.
Absolutely, and, you can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. You very well said, Karen. The community, is greater than the sum of its parts, and I think you raise what you say when we what I took from the book in our conversation and just in general, what I hope people take away if they're listening to our conversation is that we don't limit how we perceive community, how we try to improve our communities to how we've grown up in them. I think a lot of people, like, when you bring up, like, when I bring up train stuff and you not often, but sometimes people will be like, "Well, I like driving." Like, that's not the kind of community we are. We don't want that. And it's like, I think people are used to the way things are, and they don't it's difficult for them to imagine, um, what it could
Yes.
be, you know? And I just think that's another reason why I like the book because it creates this vision at the start of
Uh-huh.
where we could be and how, like, well, 100 years from now, our grandkids, great-grandkids could be like, "Oh my god, you burned gasoline in cars? Are you
And
crazy?"
you and
I
you
mean, the same
all
way
f
that we
yeah. Spent your
like, the
time
same way
all
that
by
we now are
yourself in a steel box?
Are you kidding me? You sat in traffic for hours when you could have taken a gondola or whatever it is that or whatever's on the horizon that
Yeah.
we're working on and developing. So I think that's very important. And yeah, like and as you say, good public transportation, because I think we're coming up on time. But that's another thing, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts on it because that notion of community that you get from riding public transportation is so important. So a little anecdote. I was taking the train to the city for social studies teaching fellowship I have. We have like one in-person session like once every couple months. And I was taking it down and I saw an older woman reading a book on the train with her bag on the seat. And another woman came up to her and like smacked the seat in front of her and was like, "Why didn't you move your stuff?" And just like stormed off. I was very confrontational, and I was a little far away, so I just saw it happen. And the woman who's reading turned to these younger kids, like, younger than me, and was like, "What? I would have moved if she asked me." And they were like, "Yeah, I don't know why she's being that way." And they ended up having a conversation, and I kinda watched from over my book, this older
Uh-huh.
woman and these young kids, college age, yucking it up, chatting the whole way down to Grand Central, and I was like, "Wow, that's what you don't get when you drive," you know?
Yeah.
So I was wondering what your thoughts are on that, the idea of, like, community rather than isolation in your car.
Oh, I think it's so important. It's one of the reasons that people don't take public transportation because 'cause they're nervous just about other people. But, of course, that mostly comes from never not having that experience. Once it becomes a normal experience, um, it's you can just read your book. Sometimes you end up talking to other people or listening to other conversations and learning something about other people. It's always interesting, but it does worry me. We talk a lot about loneliness. We hear and read a lot about the loneliness epidemic, and especially the problem after COVID about people feeling isolated and not knowing how to connect. And those kind of casual connections you make in a setting like a train, because you have a certain shared experience, right? Just in terms of often where you're going, but just the experience of being on the train and dealing with the conductor or finding out where, best place to put your suitcase, has somebody helping you with your luggage. Um, That's really important for all of us to feel comfortable being around other people and getting to know them, learning about them. Otherwise, we just our skills atrophy, and we need many levels. There's intimate relationships and close friendships, but life is full and should be and is enriched by all these diverse, connections with other human beings. Um, and so I
I
think that's a
I agree.
great example.
I love
And
that story, and I mentioned this the Oh, go ahead.
oh, I was thinking that a young man who contacted me to talk about whether public transportation could be a third place. He was saying that what because he was, from Mexico, but a grad student in London, and he was saying, "People are so quiet on the train here." He said compared to Mexico, he said, "It sound like it's a party in Mexico." And when it
That is
is
really funny to hear.
yeah,
I
and
w I would not believe that because I was gonna say, like, the inverse to my story, and, any listeners who are on the fence about trains are still good, but the inverse of was I mentioned in my email, I made my wife take the train to see a concert in Port Chester, and as we were coming back to our neck of the woods in Connecticut, there was, like, a Yankees game or something, and some gentlemen got on, and they were clearly feeling no pain, enjoying themselves after the game, and yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna lie, I'm not gonna say it was the most pleasant experience to hear them running their mouths loudly after a
Mm.
ball game, but I add on to that, and apparently in Mexico, it's even louder, so that's an interesting kind of, addendum. Of course we want peace, of course we want quiet, of course we want, our sense of space for sure and respect for personal space, and we should always be considerate of others. Sometimes it's nice to know your neighbors even when they annoy you, and I think learning to live with people who annoy you is probably the best remedy for loneliness, being like, "You know what? I'm never gonna find my perfect person, even my best friends annoy me, and you know what? Being around people even when they're annoying is still a valuable
And
experience."
sometimes people can really surprise you. I hear stories like that quite often, of a young person. Sometimes people are kind of nervous about teenagers. They seem like a little unpredictable and absorbed.
Yeah.
And then they help you with something,
Mhm,
and
mhm.
they're offer you their seat, or I mean, I have that, and then you think, wow, the world isn't a better place than sometimes people say it is. It's actually
Wasn't that
you
nice?
Mhm. Yeah,
Wasn't that nice?
it's uplifting when that sort of thing happens. So we have to take there's
And,
rough spots now and again, but
yeah, of course, and what you like and you don't get that in your car, and you know what, like, of course, my wife was probably like, "I wish we just drove, like, why'd you make us take the train? Like, this is loud," and it was running late and stuff, but there is something to be said exactly for keeping your heart open, for feeling like you're part of a community. We chatted with some young woman on the platform, how she was going back to her job, and it's nice. I mean, as you point out, and I wrote an article recently about zoning, like, a lot of times people will bring up, and I agree with them, that there's definitely oh, poor Mystic is playing with a box. If you heard some rustling, that's what that is. Um, she just knocked it over. But anyway, as I was saying, people lament the fracturing of community, but we have an infrastructural paradigm that inhibits spontaneous connection. We
yeah.
sit in our pods to go to work silently. We see our coworkers maybe you work from home or something like that, and then you get back in your pod by yourself. Maybe you catch up on a podcast or you listen to some music,
Uh,
and then you see your family, and all of those people are valuable and important, and that's really great. But when do you have the opportunity to see your neighbor and have a conversation with them? And when do you have the opportunity, to run into somebody who's, wearing a hat that you're not a big fan of, but then you get to talking to them and you're like, you know what, like maybe there's something there. Maybe we're more in common than we think. And I think that's that like sort of this is vibes-oriented sociology, so, I'm sure somebody will probably correct me. I can't help but feel that the political, social divisions that have really taken root in America and are really toxic are in part because we just don't talk to each other that often. We don't really have the opportunity to engage informally.
Right, we've spread ourselves out, we live apart, we drive everywhere by ourselves, and then we're surprised we're lonely. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
I'll tell
Yeah.
you just for conclusion, one thing that happened to me on the train that comes to mind that's still touching is I was on a train from, Guangzhou in southern China to Hong Kong, and it was pretty early days for me in China, and I was doing this by myself, and I was a little nervous, and there was an African man, there are a lot of African traders in that part of China, an African man sitting next to me who spoke English, and he wanted to talk, and we talked for a bit, and he was so excited about my being from America, and after we chatted for a bit, he put his hand on his heart and he said, "When you go back to your country, please take my greetings to your people." And, that we connect, there's a global community too. And,
Mhm. True that.
um, yeah. So, all right, good to talk to you, as ever,
Great talking to you, Karen.
and good
Yep.
luck with that lovely kitten.
Yeah, glad I of course, yeah, we need it, but I love talking about the book. Hopefully, we can chat again soon,
Yeah,
and yeah, we'll link up. I've been working on, you know, I'm hoping that maybe I can start getting in touch with more people and get some movement on Connecticut's line of part of the Berkshire line. I feel like if the Triton campaign wants to focus on anything, because Massachusetts is already done, we can at least
yeah,
go to them and say like, "Hey, like, they already finished.
right.
Like,
So
what's
stay
the holdup?"
tuned,
So,
Connecticut. We're coming for you.
yes, exactly.
All right, great. Take care,
That's
Matt.
great. All right.
Okay,
Talk
yep,
to you soon,
yep,
Karen.
bye.